So, what did Paul think about the Roman Empire? More pointedly, was he anti-Rome? Or, to put it in youth pastor slang, did Paul have beef with Rome? Honestly, these are difficult, if not impossible, questions to nail down with certainty. For one, we don't have autobiographies from Paul except for a few snapshots in his letters. And second, we don't have a comprehensive work that outlines his theology. So this means that we don't have what Paul thought about various topics unless he wrote about them in letters preserved in the New Testament. And much of those letters are situational. They're speaking to burning questions or issues particular to the community that he writes to. So because of this, we don't know what Paul thought about a lot of things, even things that we consider really important. For instance, we don't know what Paul thought about Jesus' virgin birth, or what he thought about hell. Or think about Paul's thoughts on communion or the Lord's Supper. If Paul never mentioned that practice in 1 Corinthians 10 through 11, we would know nothing from Paul on the Lord's Supper. So all this is to say, we need to acknowledge the possible limitations we have and we're experiencing in constructing a comprehensive Pauline theology. And this matters to this topic because Paul doesn't have a ton to say about the Roman Empire. He never mentions Rome outright. He speaks of governing authorities in a few places. He briefly mentions Caesar's household in Philippians and instructs Christians to pray for kings and all those in authority in 1 Timothy 2. And one can also draw some other possible allusions in Paul's comments throughout his letters. But some would then maybe think, but certainly Paul has something to say. He had to say something about this great evil of the first century, of empire. Empire is an oppressive force in God's world, a contagion of Babylon that distorts the creation politic of God's blessing that he intended. Michael Gorman defines empire as this, as an entity that has come to widespread global or nearly global dominance through deliberate expansion by means of the extreme exercise of some forms of power, economic, political, military, and or religious, resulting in the creation of colony-like clients of the entity and of enemies who perceive the entity as oppressive. Surely, Rome fits the bill for this definition, and so surely Paul must have beef with Rome. In response to this impulse to find Paul's criticism of the Roman Empire, many have sought to place Rome in the crosshairs of Paul through a variety of strategies. A notable one is the hidden criticism hypothesis. This claims that although Paul didn't explicitly mention Rome or overtly criticize Rome, he criticizes Rome in a coded or hidden way throughout his letters. For example, Neil Elliott applies the work of James C. Scott to argue that there is a counter-imperial subtext in Paul's letters, a hidden transcript below the surface or between the lines, where Paul launches a sneak attack at Rome. N.T. Wright proposes a more nuanced view, but he similarly sets Rome in Paul's sights through subtle snubs and allusions for those with ears to hear. So my question is this a helpful way to construct Paul's view of Rome? Through winks, subtleties, and background reconstructions. Contextualization can certainly surface things that modern readers miss. We should not discount that. But I think there's a better way to construct Paul's view of Rome. I don't think the best way to construct Paul's view of Rome is by searching for subtle, masked, counter-imperial passage. This method is unconvincing to me for several reasons. For one, it's methodologically lacking. John Barclay notes that Richard Hayes' method for detecting scriptural echoes doesn't translate well to detecting imperial echoes. With scripture, right, we have an abundant evidence of Paul's engagement. You have direct citations, allusions, sustained arguments. To posit a similar engagement with the Roman Empire would require a similar evidential base, and we simply don't have it. Christoph Heilig goes further, arguing that Richard Hayes' criteria, which is often used in detecting echoes of imperial propaganda in Paul, that this criteria lacks the proper controls to guard against a confirmation bias. So the danger, Heilig warns, is that intuitive decisions, which are made in advance, are sanctioned afterwards by tests, which have the appearance of the scientific method. So at its worst, the method of detecting these echoes of imperial propaganda becomes a fancy form of finding what you're already looking for. And there's several other reasons that I could go through to say why I don't think searching for like subtle things like this or coded criticisms is the best method. Like Paul's personality, he's quite bold and even instructing others to preach boldly, even to Caesar's household in Philippians 1. But my biggest gripe with these kinds of readings of trying to find Rome and Paul this way is with three things. And it's what they tend to ignore. Maybe Paul was measured with his criticism of Rome, but I think we can account for this without searching between the lines. We don't need hidden criticism because Paul's explicit claims already do the heavy lifting. And to see this, we need to understand three things. One, Paul's clear cosmic vision of the powers. Two, his spiritual material connection in light of Jewish political theology, what Dr. Mike Heiser calls a Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And three, his gospel paradigm, which is a political paradigm in Paul. Okay, so I'm going to go through each of these in order. So first, counter-imperial readings can err on the side of ignoring the bigger, larger, more prevalent opponent in Paul. Who could be bigger than the Roman Empire? Well, Paul looks further up and further beneath the political forces of the world and speaks to the larger powers or forces at work in the world. John Barclay says that there are two basic sides for Paul. On one side, you have the Spirit and grace. On the other side, sin, death, flesh, and sometimes Satan or daimonion. I think other key terms need to fit here as well, but the point is the Roman Empire is not one of these cosmic forces. It's not big enough. It can be co-opted by these forces, but it is not in itself one of them. And Paul's real target are these cosmic forces, which can also be referred to as the powers and principalities. Now, these powers for Paul are not merely otherworldly or strictly spiritual, and this is really key. They are both spiritual and material, theological and political. For example, Paul makes it clear that these powers are spiritual in Ephesians chapter 6. He says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So this makes a clear distinction between the powers, alongside synonymous terms like rulers and authorities, and flesh and blood. So it's marking them as spiritual forces in the heavenly realms. However, other places in Paul demonstrate that these forces and powers are also operative in the real world. The best example of this is 1 Corinthians 2, 6 through 8. There, Paul speaks of the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing and who have crucified the Lord of glory. Since crucifixion was a Roman practice, many see this as a reference to Roman authorities. In fact, Christoph Heilig calls this an open criticism of Roman authorities. So it appears best to see the powers operative within human proxies and within human kingdoms and political powers. And there's a few other examples in Paul's writings that could attest to this as well. But the key is that to recognize the higher level of cosmic forces is not to completely spiritualize all of the world's problems. In fact, it is still very much political. Part of the issue is that Paul's politics is theological, spiritual, and material. And when modern interpreters look to Paul, they tend to separate the spiritual and the material and assign the latter to political. So this wrecks the investigation of Paul's politics before it even begins. John Barclay notes, Paul's language of powers thus denotes comprehensive features of reality which penetrate what we call the political sphere, but only as it is enmeshed in larger and more comprehensive force fields. Therefore, Paul's theology, it is political. It is not privatized. It's not spiritualized or detached from social and political realities of everyday life. However, that political theology is more spiritual and cosmic than we tend to imply in our use of the term politics. So why does this matter? Because I think it puts Rome in its proper space and place when reading Paul. Paul reframes reality and estimates Rome in light of a larger cosmic drama, which reduces them to what Barclay says is comparative insignificance. The apostle undermines Rome not by confronting them on their own terms, but by reducing them to a but-part player in a drama scripted by the cross and resurrection of Jesus. So notice the paradox here. Paul is indeed undermining Rome and subverting their claims, but he does this on his terms and in his theological categories. He does not even afford Rome the dignity of competing on the same field. To use a baseball metaphor, Paul sees Rome as a minor league team on a major league field. And the major league teams are the powers of sin, death, Satan versus spirit and grace, principalities and powers. In fact, and this is huge, if we mischaracterize Rome as the chief enemy for Paul, we are falling into the very deception of totalizing Rome's imperial power. To borrow and adapt a statement from Shane J. Wood in his book on Revelation, he says to reduce Paul's letters, he was talking about John, but to reduce Paul's letters to an anti-Roman document is to embrace the satanic deception that the empire is the chief enemy in the war against God's people. So that's my first issue with counter-imperial readings of Paul that look for these subtle echoes and things like that. They can err on the side of ignoring the bigger, larger, more prevalent opponent in Paul and to work in Paul's terms and categories. And it can paradoxically inflate Rome's importance in Paul's thinking, which is exactly what we don't want to do. But when Paul speaks against the powers, in many ways, he speaks to Rome indirectly, not through some coded means, but through baked-in assumptions of a political theology that's informed by the Hebrew scripture. And that leads to my second thing that I want to raise. I think we can explain Paul's views of the powers within the streams of Jewish political theology, where spiritual forces are at work behind the nations and political powers. Michael Heiser labels this a Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And Michael Heiser is not the only one who discusses this. I also read a book, Daniel Block, The Gods of the Nations. G.B. Card, I think that's how you pronounce his name, wrote a book, Principalities and Powers, where he links Paul's views of the principalities and powers back to Deuteronomy 32 and other passages. And then most recently, Joel Muddamalle wrote a book called The Unseen Battle, which really expands on Heiser's work in some fresh ways. But what this testifies to is an event where the nations were scattered at the Tower of Babel episode, but there was also a spiritual component to this, where you can see this in verses 8 through 9 here, where God, as the Most High, divided or assigned lands to nations and divided up the human race, fixing their borders or establishing the boundaries of the people according to the number in his heavenly court. Another way to translate that is according to the number of the sons of God. There's some translation stuff that we need to get into with that, but you can read some of those other resources to hear that. The point is, each nation has been assigned, in a Deuteronomy 32 worldview, an angelic cosmic ruler and guardian, except Israel, as we see in verse 9. Israel comes under the direct sovereignty of God. Jacob was God's possession, placed under his authority, but other nations were delegated to other spiritual beings, to lesser Elohim, as a judgment from the Most High Yahweh. These lesser Elohim, right, although they had been delegated authority over these other nations, these lesser Elohim, sons of God, however, rebel. We read this in Psalm 82. They, instead of ruling under Yahweh's authority, they ruled with injustice. Much like how his human representatives in human household in the garden rejected God's authority, so too did his heavenly household. So the remainder of the Old Testament pits Yahweh against those gods and Israel against their nations. Again, there's a lot of more resources to dive into this, but the major point is that Jewish political theology expanded the political into a cosmic perspective where spiritual beings and political powers were more intertwined. There's also evidence from other Second Temple Jewish literature that supports this series of events and understanding of a Deuteronomy 32 worldview, the Testament of Naphtali, Sirach 17:17, Jubilees. These are referenced in some of those other works. But I think, and this is key, a Deuteronomy 32 worldview should factor in to our reading of Paul's politics. So, referencing this passage alongside Daniel 10, which depicts various princes over certain areas, Michael Heiser claims that these passages are the foundation for Paul's theology of the unseen world. So in Daniel 10, you read of this prince of Persia, the prince of Greece, and the prince of Michael having this kind of contest. And the Greek translation of prince can be archon. And Paul uses that language to talk about the rulers of the age, the ruler of the kingdom of the power of the air, and the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. So I think there can be this connection between Paul's use of the powers and principalities language and the rulers language to what is being described in the Old Testament as it relates to geographical, territorial powers and spiritual beings. So this last reference here shows the rulers and the authorities. It shows how there's some interchangeable terms in Paul's letters that we can look for powers and try to sort that out. So you have these various terms that I think point to what Paul is looking at in terms of political powers and spiritual powers at work behind the world. This can be very heady, and if this is new to you, again, I suggest all those other resources to kind of dive further. But my main point here is that Paul sees a political landscape within a larger cosmic vision. So if we are to identify Paul's view of Rome, his language about the powers appear to be the best place of exploration. What Paul says about the powers can reasonably point us to what Paul thinks about Rome. So what does Paul say about the powers? Well, it's very interesting. He says that Christ has disarmed the powers and authorities through his cross and his kingship on the cross. The powers have been disarmed, stripped, and doomed to destruction. It's as if these powers have been conquered and now they are participating in a triumphal procession en route to their ultimate demise. And the ultimate demise and destruction of the powers will come at the end when Christ Jesus has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. In other words, Paul's outright criticism of the powers included Rome. And within Paul's Jewish political theology, the material political power of Rome would have been tangled up in the principalities and powers. To criticize the powers would be to criticize Rome within a larger criticism. So this isn't a hidden criticism, it's a larger criticism. And it's not hidden in Paul's letters. It's baked in to his Old Testament informed political theology. So that's the second thing that I believe enhances our perception of Rome in Paul. It's not necessarily ignored by counter-imperial interpreters of Paul. They don't ignore the powers. But it needs to be more emphasized within the conversation. Thirdly and lastly, we need to direct our gaze to Paul's politic in plain sight, Paul's gospel. A surface reading of Paul misses his political message because we tend to miss the political message of the gospel. As Graham Twelftree notes, the gospel was one of the central and centralizing concepts in Paul's thought and theology. And this gospel was a political statement. We can see this in his most definitive passages on the gospel, which are found in 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 1. For the sake of space and time, I'm only going to point to the Romans 1 passage here. But in Romans 1, Paul begins by describing the gospel, which centers on Jesus being sent as a Davidic Christ, as the one who was resurrected and is now appointed as the Son of God in power. Jesus is Lord, and he has been empowered and commissioned, he has empowered and commissioned Paul to call all nations, all ethne, all Gentiles, as it's translated in the NIV, to give their allegiance, their faithfulness to Jesus. So for Paul, this is the good news. The Jewish Messiah is now Lord of all. So Paul centers his apostolic mission around a political statement that's good news for all nations. It's a political event that has the power to save those who express faithfulness, trust, and loyalty. So the gospel reveals a righteousness, a justness of God, where the faithful can live within that righteousness. By allegiance to this new king. So this is a theopolitical gospel, in the words of Michael Gorman, and it's of first importance for Paul. We see that in 1 Corinthians 15. He calls it of first importance. So if we want to think about Paul's politics, I think we should look to Paul's gospel. And this is everywhere in Paul. Paul is the most prolific user of gospel language in the Bible. He used the gospel word group 84 times. By far the most prolific user. And furthermore, he distinctly developed its usage as a definitive singular noun, as the gospel, which might have some bearing on how he relates this political announcement to other politics of the day, right? Rome could talk about gospels when Caesar Augustus was born. You can see this in the Priene inscription, calendar inscription of Priene. When Caesar Augustus was born, it was proclaimed as good news, as gospel. But Paul is going around talking about the gospel. And I think this fits within a larger theme that we see in Paul's letters, which is that he posits a supra-imperial politics, not an anti-imperial, counter-imperial. That would be to equate the two as competitors. Paul sees it as a supra-imperial claim, that the gospel is declaring that Jesus is now enthroned above all powers, including the cosmic powers, which also includes Rome. So in all respects, Paul is beholden to this political claim that Jesus is the saving king who reigns supreme in the whole cosmos. He sees a superior political reality in King Jesus. In Christ, all things, including thrones, lordships, rulers, and powers, were created by him and for him. Jesus, the Messiah, is Lord. Every knee will bow to him. He is the appointed Son of God in power. Jesus is seated far above all rule, authority, power, and dominion, and every name that is invoked, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. And I'm throwing all of this out at us because I want us to see this supreme political claim that Paul continually makes. This is at the center of Paul's gospel, and it is political through and through. However, despite this, Despite Jesus' superior cosmic lordship, his reign is also manifest in a specific people. He is over all things, yes, but he is especially the head over his kingdom body called the church, or the assembly. In Ephesians, Paul writes, "And God placed all things under his feet and appointed him to be head over everything for the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills everything in every way." Those who belong to the church participate in his kingdom, his body politic now. So this has a lot of relations to how, or a lot of influence in how we relate to other political bodies as followers of the Supreme King, Jesus. But this is kind of a one-liner that summarizes it. Paul's supra-imperial politic is meant to be practiced and embodied as an alter-imperial politic in the church, Christ's political assembly on earth. And I'm borrowing alter-imperial there from Shane J. Wood. But let me show this to you just from one passage. Paul continually instructs the church to live out the gospel, to live in light of this supreme political claim. But this is one of the explicit places that we can tie it together. In Philippians 1:27, Paul instructs them, the Philippians, to conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And it's very interesting. One of the words used there is politeuste, which is this conduct of a body politic. It's political language to talk about a certain type of political conduct. So we could translate this as only act as a body politic in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. So Paul uses the gospel not only as a story of God's activity, but as Nijay Gupta says, also as a standard, an oath, an ethos, a guide for the way Christians should live. So Paul is calling them to exercise a political kind of life, politeuste, that flows out of a political proclamation, the euangelion. And what does this conduct entail? In short, Paul's main focus is on the church's shared life together, his desire for them to remain faithful and firm as the political body that belongs to King Jesus. And so when I think we put these things in place, we see Paul's politics everywhere. Paul's main message is a political claim of Jesus as supreme king. Paul's main ethics is a political type of conduct that flows from that political claim and lands in the political body called the church. So, did Paul have beef with Rome? Yes. Yes, but not in the way we might expect. Paul didn't need to name Rome as his opponent because his theology already accounted for it within a far larger drama. His cosmic vision of the powers situated Rome as a minor league player co-opted by the forces of sin, death, and Satan, forces that Christ has already disarmed and will ultimately destroy. His Jewish political theology, rooted in Deuteronomy 32, assumed that earthly political powers were entangled with spiritual rulers behind the nations, meaning that every word Paul spoke against the principalities and powers implicitly spoke against their earthly proxies, Rome included. And his gospel, the politically charged announcement that the crucified and risen Jesus is the Davidic king and cosmic lord, constituted the most subversive claim imaginable in a world where Caesar demanded ultimate allegiance. Paul didn't sneak his critique of Rome between the lines. He proclaimed it from the rooftops every time he announced that Jesus is Lord. The irony is that Paul's politic was so much bigger than Rome that to reduce his letters to an anti-Roman program would be to grant the empire an importance Paul refused to give it. Paul sees it this way: Rome wasn't a rival. Rome is beneath his king's feet.